Hello, everyone, and welcome to day two of the third Canadian Language Advocacy Day and our Language Rights Canada conference. My name is Patricia Ribeiro, and I will be your host for today. Yesterday's event brought us inspiring stories on Indigenous language preservation, language and storytelling, and advocating with the Sustainable Development Goals. We have a lot of more exciting content today from language advocates across Canada. So let's get right to it. To access interpretation in French, click the widget that says Interprify. Select your preferred audio language from the list of available options. The default setting, None, allows you to hear the main audio. To access captions, click on the eye icon to select the captions language. Then select your preferred language for captions from the list of available options. The default setting, None, indicates captions will not be displayed. I am very excited to introduce our keynote speaker for today, Dr. Beverly Buchanan from the Department of Deaf Studies at Deaf Education at Lamar University. Everyone, please join me in welcoming Beverly for a presentation on Maritime Sign Language in Canada.
Great. Thank you very much. Hello, everybody. Thank you very much for the invitation to speak here today. Maritime Sign Language is the language that I grew up with. It's the language, my mother tongue, as they say, and that I grew up with in my home. I'm going to explain a little bit today about Maritime Sign Language. We call this language MSL. And I'll share a little bit more in depth with you about my research and plans for the future. All right, let's get going. Just a little bit about me before we get started. I've been deaf from birth. I grew up in Halifax, Nova Scotia. And you can see there's a picture of my parents in the middle here. They were married there in 1952. They met each other at the deaf school in Halifax. They fell in love, they got married, they had 3 children together. My oldest sister there, you can see us on the right. And then my middle sister with that hat on. And then myself, I'm the baby. All of us as a family used MSL in our house growing up, and MSL had a huge influence on my life. We're a deaf household, deaf family, and that was our primary language in our household. I mean, the dog is hearing, but the rest of us were all deaf. I'm just going to give a quick educational background for myself. I attended a private school, and that was Armbray Academy in Halifax, a private girls' school, actually. So I was placed there at 9 years old, and that was specifically for language acquisition reasons. I really liked school. I had been reading a lot ever since I was a toddler, and my parents really wanted me to have a good general educational foundation in science and math and English. So there was obviously a struggle with communication access at the time. There was no sign language interpreters. So I was really itching for a higher education. So I attended Gallaudet University, and or Gallaudet College at the time. It's since changed to be a university. I was 16, which is quite young, but I was very keen to continue my studies. I graduated with a bachelor's degree in biology, and then still seeking out more education, I went to McDaniel College in Maryland, And looking for more there, I did my master's degree in sign language education. And then still looking for more, I did my doctorate at Lamar University and just finished that last year with a research focus in maritime sign language, which is what I'm here to talk to you about today. I first really need to thank the people who pushed me to do this education, to do this research in the first place. You see their pictures here, and without whom it just wouldn't be possible. My mother is front and center there because she was the person who taught me MSL and who taught me how to read and write in English. And without her, just nothing would be possible. My father is from Western Canada and he uses American Sign Language, ASL. He moved here to meet my mother when he was about 18 years of age. So I grew up with both ASL and MSL. And my mother using MSL only. The Maritime Sign Language research book is dedicated to my mother, and it's just a key research that hearing people also can use and to refer to when talking about these languages. And of course, I need to thank Lamar University for the support and the mentorship. I'm going to talk about the origins of Maritime Sign Language. About 80% of Maritime Sign Language is from an old British Sign Language. There is not a lot of documentation that exists in the time period about these languages, plus a lot of mobility at the time and migration at the time. A lot of English settlers from the 1600s and 1700s brought these sign languages with them, with the deaf people who came along with the early settlers. In 1856, the Halifax School for the Deaf was established. And right before then, you see the two people on the screen here, William Gray and George Tate, the two men on the right. They were both the first benefactors to set up the Halifax School of the Deaf. They are both Scottish and born in Scotland and migrated to Nova Scotia. So they would use the old British Sign Language. They moved to Halifax before 1856 and established this school. They had lived in a small house and the landlord lived above them who had a deaf child. And the landlord knew that their renters were deaf men themselves. So they charged them with educating the deaf children that they knew. So they taught the landlord's child and then other deaf children from the Halifax area. It was kind of a homemade classroom in the backyard. And then it was 12 students, and then they kept growing. And they kept growing that little schoolroom until it became a classroom. George Tate and William Gray both were teaching in a British Sign Language, so they started with that. The priest saw that this classroom had just sprung up there, so lobbied the government to make it official, and in 1856 established the Halifax School of the Deaf, which kept running until 1961. A lot of the teachers were nuns who were also from England. So, and they brought with them their sign language as well, including the two-handed fingerspelling alphabet or two-hand manual alphabet. So the reason that we research Maritime Sign Language is because it is a language that's integral to the deaf community in this area. And when we think about sign languages, they really belong to the deaf community and they grow from the deaf community as well. If you look in GLOT log 4.6, it does list Maritime Sign Language as an endangered language. It is a language that we're losing. So it is very important to document and preserve this language at the moment before it becomes extinct. Here's an example of Maritime Sign Language. Oh, I thought it might play, but I don't think it's going to. mentioned that MSL is an endangered language. And endangered sign languages are more at risk than endangered spoken languages. So the preservation becomes critical. It's far easier to risk losing sign languages than it is with spoken languages. So I encourage that when we're thinking about preserving world languages that are endangered, we also think about preserving world sign languages that are endangered. The research of maritime sign language started in 1972 with some publications and some video documentation and some preservation efforts. And that is ongoing. There's always more documentation needed, and especially more filming documentation that's required for preservation of this language. So the purpose of documentation primarily is for preservation for future use, future community members to see the language, and for historical purposes, especially the historical culture of Atlantic Canada. This is my theoretical framework for my research. So again, primarily the focus is on documenting an endangered language, which also strengthens the empirical frameworks in general for linguistic analysis. It is a little bit small. It is quite heavy on data for a language that is little known, so preservation and documentation becomes important there. There's also, of course, the opportunity to increase resources in research so that other researchers may network and use the same information. And also to preserve human cultural heritage. Documentation is also important for archival purposes, which also keeps us accountable to the deaf community in Nova Scotia to be able to collect all of this information and document it. And the study of language contact is also possible with this kind of language documentation, where language transfer happened and where the boundaries are between languages and how they came to be. I'm looking at what's left here. Yes, of course. Documentary corpus is very important as well, so that all language planning has to start with a corpus first, and then can be linguistically analyzed from there. Right now, in a digital world that we're in, we have this opportunity to do language preservation work that is not only with frozen, unchanging media. We can also use video preservation techniques with the tools that are available for us. I'm going to talk a little bit about my methodology, which were primarily, well, twofold: corpus linguistics, and then using my own autoethnography of my own lived experience with the language. Just to go back to this a little bit, first, ELAN, this is the software that I used, which does capture analysis really easily because you can make annotations as needed along the way in the video. I'm going to tell you a little bit about my study design. I used 20 videos. The participants analyzed were 20 deaf adults, and it took me about 5 months of analysis to capture all of the MSL specific signs. In the data, what was really well represented in the signs is that altogether I found 3,209 signs, and they were organized into different categories: frequent signs, grammar and phrases, gendered signs, contact and interference, and then any MSL signs that were unique. A lot of the frequent signs that we saw were around the category of work. So overall, I found many nouns, not as many verbs, but mostly nouns. In the grammar, we didn't find a lot. A lot of the grammar, I mean, included in the language, but wasn't separated out into categories in the findings. There was a significant gendered use of categories of signs. So you'll see that women and men use different signs. And this is really reflective of the time. Some gendered signs are that women would often talk about things that involved homemaking, sewing and cooking and child rearing, whereas the male signers would often talk about work and sports and travel. We found that often in the research and categorized it that way. The male signers also had more code switching between MSL and ASL and a lot more interference and language contact. So potentially that is due to a lot of the travel that men did. They went to a lot of sports tournaments in other places, in other provinces. And so they would pick up different languages along the way. Women, again, at the time, often stayed home. And so their language was much more stable and had significantly less contact and interference as compared to the male signers. Some really interesting findings that we noticed was that some unique MSL signs, like this one for family or for relative or aunt, they would sign it like this on the wrist. So it's really interesting etymologically to try to figure out where that came from. Also, the MSL sign for hamburger isn't found anywhere else. I remember my parents, and this is an example of intergenerational language transfer, where my parents would use that sign. And you can see in older videos that people are using an older sign for hamburger. This is the sign that I was using is the ASL sign, but the MSL sign is significantly more iconic, and it looks more like a old-fashioned meat grinder. So the MSL sign for hamburger, you can see in the pictures here, is more iconic and looks like a meat grinder, where the ASL sign for hamburger is more widespread these days. The two men on the bottom are are brothers, and they're talking about Halloween there. There's a couple of varieties for Halloween. This is the old MSL sign for Halloween, and which seems to be unique to MSL as well, isn't found anywhere else. There are some limitations of this research. The videos are a little bit older, and during the pandemic, I couldn't come to Nova Scotia to collect any more current videos. The videos are of older people using historical MSL. I do believe that there is more in the... If we could look back to the 1920s or 30s, we would be able to find more. It's about 100 years ago now, but of course there wasn't any video that was taken there. I wish we had the capability in the time when MSL was really in its heyday, around when the Halifax School was open in the 1800s till about 1930, but unfortunately we don't have that. So just looking at the time, let me talk about where we go from here. This research is ongoing, as it must be. I'm going to continue looking for older videos if they do exist. And I've put a call out to the deaf community that if anybody has any older videos, you know, if they're in Betamax or VHS or any film strips lying around somewhere, The quality of those videos from the past need some digital work to make them readable so that we can actually capture them appropriately. So hopefully when I can do some of that collecting, right now we have 3,209 tokens. And so those have all been edited and digitally preserved. We're going to be creating a digital dictionary for maritime sign language. There's an opportunity to collaborate with other countries who are experiencing the same kind of language endangerment and language lost. There's certainly the opportunity to collect and share ideas and initiatives about language preservation for our old sign languages that exist. And of course, there's always the opportunity for more publication. Maritime sign language has a lot left that can be discussed and researched and published. Something that I think might be of interest to this community, the United Nations has an International Day of Sign Languages, which is annual on September 23rd. And this is a day to celebrate sign languages worldwide. Also of interest, Bill C-81, which is the Accessible Canada Act, did recognize ASL, LSQ, and Indigenous Sign Languages as primary languages of deaf people in Canada. Unfortunately, that act does not recognize maritime sign language. So there is still work to be done to even within our own maritime provinces to have that work recognized. When I was in Halifax for a week recently, I met a lot of folks there who are still using MSL. It isn't extinct yet. It is definitely still around and it is still used. It would be very nice to get this language documented, to have these resources available so that folks who are of an older generation, when they are in the hospital or when they need to, they can communicate in maritime sign language. This is a language that can be used by youth as well. There needs to be more exposure to MSL. So along with preservation effort, there can also be a revitalization effort that is parallel. MSL is endangered, but it is definitely still a living language in the maritime provinces. In Newfoundland and in Prince Edward Island, in New Brunswick and in Nova Scotia, the Atlantic provinces still use MSL as a social language. And ever since the 1960s in North America, when ASL became more widespread, that was when language contact really happened and ASL spread to Nova Scotia. There became a principal of the School of the Deaf from the United States. And the older teachers who were at the Halifax School of the Deaf, the ones who would use MSL, they retired early or they moved elsewhere. So that was when significant language shift happened in the 1960s. So you'll find with people who graduated from the Halifax School for the Deaf are still very strong MSL users. And then people who graduated from the other school for the deaf, they were more strongly influenced by American Sign Language, or they have a little bit of a mixed sign language. My request for you at Language Advocacy is to please recognize Maritime Sign Language as a language of Atlantic Canadians. And there's always the hope that we can provide more resources and do more language preservation, which of course always relies on more funding. So there is always a lot of grant writing. There's a lot of community involvement to do this very important work to make this happen. I think we will end on time. And that's all. If there are any questions, please let me know. Thank you very much for taking the time to watch my presentation today and for learning about our history.
Thank you, Beverly, for that incredible opening of day 2 of our Language Advocacy Day celebrations. As you may know, this year's conference aims to connect language advocacy to the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. As when we fight for human rights, there should be no language left behind, regardless of the language someone speaks or signs. Next, we would like to feature a video on how deaf and hard of hearing communities can advocate with the SDGs from the World Federation of the Deaf, which will be followed by a video presentation from Dr. Nadia Kaidi of University of Toronto, who will be discussing language, identity, and the role of libraries.
Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs in brief. The Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs, are included in the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. The SDGs consist of 17 goals and 169 targets. To measure whether these goals and targets are realized, the UN General Assembly adopted the Global Indicator Framework containing 232 indicators. But why do we have the SDGs? The SDGs were developed by governments in collaboration with civil society and the UN system with the aim of identifying global challenges and providing related solutions. These challenges include poverty, hunger, poor quality of education, and reducing inequality and other issues such as the protection of the planet. The 2030 Agenda replaces the Millennium Development Goals and is a roadmap to a better future for humanity and our planet to ensure that sustainable development is realized worldwide by 2030. The 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development was adopted by the member of states of the UN General Assembly in 2015. It demonstrates a political commitment by world leaders. The 2030 Agenda is a substantive 35-page document containing 5 sections. Section 3 contains the Sustainable Development Goals. Each of the 17 goals addresses specific problems. Here are some examples. In addressing hunger issues, there is a goal 2 focusing on zero hunger and quality of food. Educational issues are raised in goal 4, quality of education. And gender inequality in goal 5, gender equality. The SDGs are an opportunity for you. Once you know how to use the SDGs, you can make an impact on their implementation at the national level. The thinking behind these goals is to establish interlinkages between the different thematic topics and to realize a better world for all. For example, it is not possible to eradicate poverty without living in a safe environment without discrimination, without quality of education, and equal opportunities for employment. All the goals and targets are interlinked, and as such, there is an intention to break down the silos and segregated way of thinking. For deaf people, this means that by using the SDGs in their advocacy work, more government doors should open. National governments need to include deaf people and persons with disabilities in their processes concerning the implementation of the SDGs. We have a responsibility to ask our governments to translate the SDGs into national sign languages and hence raise awareness among deaf communities.
This brings this session to an end. Please move now to the next session. As many of you know, the Language Access Coalition of Canada's advocacy efforts began in Ontario. However, in the past year, we have been joined by advocates from across the country. Our first panel of this afternoon will feature the story from Atlantic provinces on the topic of settlement and language and advocacy. Please help me in welcoming Dr. Anne Benchette of Université de Moncton and her panelists Michel Arsenault, Marek Jagelski, and Erika Cantu. You can learn more about the panelists in the session details.